My name is Gary Kramer. I'm the publicist at Temple University Press, and this is...
I am Francis Ryan. I teach history at Temple University.
And you're the author of AFSCME's Philadelphia Story.
It's a book that details the history of Philadelphia's Public Workers Union, AFSCME, and it goes from the early 20th century up until really the present time. I think a lot of people that I grew up with in Philadelphia, it came from a family that told stories, good storytellers, and this really started at the dinner table. You know, it's a story of my grandfather's union. My grandfather, Thomas McAvoy, was a mechanic with the Philadelphia City Public Property Department, worked on police cars and fire engines. And when I was a kid, I remember during the 20th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, he had mentioned that he was involved with the civil rights movement, and I was intrigued by that, you know. And so when he passed on when I was about 14, I started to become more interested in trying to find that story. So that's the story that I found. It's the story of AFSCME in Philadelphia. One of the things that, to put it into context, is that AFSCME is the largest union in the AFL-CIO today, the powerful union in the country. And to understand its development and its roots, we really do have to come back to the streets of Philadelphia. So to know this story, it's bigger than just Philadelphia, although it is very much grounded in the history of Philadelphia. The other thing that makes this particular story, I think, so important is the fact that it was an interracial union. It was a union that brought black and white workers together at a time when Philadelphia, although the so-called city of brotherly love, actually had really its track record as far as equality for black workers within the unions actually was not that good. So AFSCME really became a model for the civil rights kind of unionism that developed really later in the 60s, but it's something that its roots are much earlier than what normally was understood. It's an account that deals with people like Frank Rizzo and Mayor Dilworth and Mayor Tate, and even they're not always as well known as you might think. But I think some of the figures that I'm most excited about introducing, one person is Bill McEntee. Bill McEntee was really the founder of the union. He was a sanitation truck driver, and he brought this union together in the 30s. And the stories that you get from this, it really is a story of families. It's about people coming together with their kids and their extended family and neighbors, and really fighting for the union on the streets of Philadelphia. And Bill McEntee really, he brought poor people together to form this union. Another figure that most Philadelphians from a certain time period would remember would be a guy named Earl Stout. Earl Stout is probably one of the more significant labor leaders of the 20th century in Philadelphia. And a lot of people saw him as quite controversial, and he was someone who arguably was the most powerful black man in Philadelphia during his reign as leader in the 60s and 70s. I think it's important to see his contribution to understanding the development of black politics. I certainly tried to present an objective view of the history of the union. It's obvious I am pro-union, and it is something that I'm currently a member of the American Federation of Teachers, and I'm proud of that. I come from a union family, obviously, so it is something that has guided this. But indeed, there is controversy in the telling of the story. For one thing, I think traditionally and historically, one of the things that makes it controversial is the fact that city workers, particularly sanitation workers, have power at the point of service, so that if they decide to go on strike, it impacts people in a more everyday kind of way than, say, if people who produce goods go on strike. So it's immediate. If you don't get your trash collected, you know that. And throughout its history, there is definitely there was that kind of sense that there's very little public support for that, particularly in more recent years. And the thing that I found interesting is that there's actually only been about 3 or 4 times when there were actually major strikes, going back to 1938. So the thing, when you actually look at it, it actually is a story of restraint in some ways. You know, you can see the sanitation workers and AFSCME as being kind of like a municipal Samson, you know, kind of like able to take on the whole city and knock it down. They rarely do that, actually. And that's an important thing to have in the story as it's told. Well, I think that the contemporary labor movement in the United States today is marked by decline, especially since the 1970s and 80s. So AFSCME has become, you know, in some ways the largest union, and it's a paradox that you have a union that continues to grow. And I think the Philadelphia story of AFSCME is one that there is a tradition that AFSCME today also embraces of racial equality, gender equality, equality for gays and lesbians, putting that forward as a progressive agenda. And I think that's an important thing. I think that AFSCME and really the entire labor movement today can look to the story of AFSCME to see that there are multiple traditions that they can draw on. There's kind of reform traditions, you know, that they were involved in reforming the city charter in the 50s. Civil rights traditions, traditions that connect not just the conditions of workers, but also conditions for all people in the city and the country. You know, like the idea that it's not just supporting goods for the actual members, but connecting to the larger community, the unemployed, the homeless. That's a kind of tradition that I think if the union's going to continue to really have power in the 21st century, that they need to embrace that, you know, social justice unionism.
And what you're saying is the Philadelphia Union is a model for other unions across the country, it's representational as opposed to an individual.
Right. Yeah, particularly, you know, the different traditions that have come up over the past few years. District Council 47 has a very strong social justice union tradition as well. And so I definitely see it as a model that they can draw on as we imagine what the labor movement can do in the 21st century.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.